Hi there, Dominic. This is a response to your video. Thanks very much for that response. A lot to think about there, so what I want to do, if it's okay, I want to pass over a couple of things relatively quickly, just acknowledging what you've said. And there's one particular thing you were talking about at the end which I found particularly interesting, so I'm going to see if I can spend a bit more time on that. The first thing you were talking about was material reductionism. Personally, I would go for methodological reductionism rather than material reductionism. I don't know if material is all there is. That's all I can say about that. But I do support the idea of empiricism linked to methodological reductionism. That there's only a certain amount of the world which we can talk about well, and we should, of course, increase our capacities to extend that boundary of what can be talked about empirically and rationally and deductively and all those kinds of things, whilst recognising that that capacity is necessarily limited. So a methodological reductionism I would agree with, whilst leaving the door open to talk about other things in a slightly different way. I tend to use the term poetic for that wide area which begins just on the nether side of psychology and keeps going. But yeah, I mean, the quotation that I wrote, well, it's not a quotation, but the sentence I wrote down after you'd finished there, because you talked about who we are, and in a materialist reductive world, where does that leave us? As I say, I'm coming from a kind of methodological reductivist position, so I would say that we are both chemistry and ideas, because you make that distinction. But I would also add that we are the chemistry of ideas and the ideas of chemistry. We came up with the ideas of chemistry, and chemistry came up with the ideas of us. So I think we're in that kind of position. Okay, the second thing you talk about was about happiness not existing, physics envy. You didn't say happiness not existing, you were quoting that from someone else and ridiculing that idea, which I would again agree with. I've recently been in a discussion about mind-independent realities and model agnosticism, model-dependent realities. And I come to that with a sense that physics envy you talk about, which is connected to material reductivism, is to do with the pursuit of a mind-independent reality. If we can get these messy minds out of the way, then we could really see what the world's really like. And of course, in that you would be able to dispense with messy and inchoate things like happiness and pain and all that kind of stuff. But of course, you'd also have to dispense with qualia, and you'd have to dispense with experience, because without any experiences, how could there be experience? And you end up with nothing to talk about. Nothing to talk about, and nothing to talk about it with. So, and you're making faith claims ultimately, not you, but one. If you are talking about mind-independent reality, you have to ultimately reside in faith claims. So I guess I'm just agreeing with you there. Talking about the world as if humans didn't exist in it is kind of foolish, really. Then you talk a little bit about the muse relating to that TED talk. I did watch that TED talk, but it was a while ago, and I can't remember the details of it. But yeah, my sense was that she was using personification lightly, recognising that not just creative people, but all of us really are colonised by our thoughts, and sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad, and ideas come to us. We don't, for the most part, come to ideas. As a little bit later on you mentioned Kevin Kelly talking about we kind of create the environment in which ideas can emerge, both within our heads and in our surroundings. We make our studios feel right so that ideas can come into the heads which are in those studios. So I would agree with that. Whether we want to call that a muse, or whether you want to be particularly narrative and personify that in a grand way, that's fine. I don't have any problem with that, and do it myself all the time. As long as we don't start pretending that other people should believe in our muse and giving it qualities and giving it powers over other people or any of those kind of things, which I know you're not saying, but by extension some religions have done that in the past, haven't they? When you talk about demons, that's certainly got some slightly unfortunate histories of people, as David Byrne says, putting on faces, what does he say, good and evil, they put on faces and they turn into people. Yeah, that's a bit of an unfortunate history. So I can kind of see why some people might be sensitive to those ideas. Then you talk about, let me see if this is where we're up to. Oh yes, you talk a little, this is one of the lead-in, you talk about the selfish gene and the Mary Midgley, Richard Dawkins conversation about genes and intentionality and selfishness. I don't know how Dawkins stands on his use of that term. I know at various times he's vacillated about whether it was a wise choice. It was certainly a good PR choice to call that book Selfish Gene, and it's really easy to understand. So in terms of an educational tool, it was good. But I do think there are unfortunate side effects, just philosophically speaking. At one point you say, for example, genes that look out for themselves will tend to survive more often. Now, to me, that's giving intentionality where it doesn't belong. I'm afraid I don't see genes as intentional in that way, or I think that's conferring intentionality on genes, because ultimately intentionality is about goals, isn't it? It's about having some sense of purpose, about having some sense of going somewhere, and devising the means to get there. Intentionality. I know that's not a particularly Brentano version of intentional, but I think that's what's lurking behind a lot of that. And genes biology overall at that level doesn't do intent, does it? It doesn't do teleology. It's essentially chemistry doing what chemistry does, and the fact that some genes survive in the bodies of next generations, making those bodies survive, is a feature of the system, isn't it? Of a whole, not of the intentionality, or even of a particular feature of any gene within that system. It's the whole reproductive, evolutionary, ecological system which is causing that to happen. So I don't think intentionality operates at any of those levels, really. It's systemic. I think I would suggest, on shaky ground here, I think intentionality only comes into being, or only becomes meaningful when it's attributed to certain systems, particularly systems which are sentient, like ourselves. I'm not even sure what I mean by selves at this point, but there is something about a self which has sentience, and that sentience brings with it purposiveness, intentionality, sense of agency, certain relationships to time, a whole things like beliefs and doubts, things that don't have any meaning, the capacity to lie, all kinds of things which only exist within intentional systems, or the intentional elements within larger systems. And I don't think genes have that. The last thing, which is really to just join together some of the things you've been talking about, because you talk about language, you talk about memes, you talk about genes, and you talk about kind of a little bit about bodies or embodiment a little bit. And it seems to me that what you're talking about there is systems, and the idea that these systems kind of flow through entities. Language flows through us, as you kind of rightly point out. It is a tool for sure, but we're also born into language, aren't we? And it flows through us and on into the next generation. Similarly, genes, we're born into a gene pool, and then the genes, assuming we do reproduce, the genes flow through us into the next generation. The gene is transgenerational, literally. Similarly with memes, we're born into a culture of ideas, and we, one way or another, either promulgate those ideas or mutate them into the next generation, into the next brain that hears those ideas, or the next piece of paper that we write those ideas down upon. And even perhaps bodies, bodies that kind of do that, don't they, to a certain extent, or bodies of some of the entities. So it's hard to know within that set of... Well, there's similarities, firstly. I mean, clearly this is something that's of interest to you, which is of interest to me too, which is that these are all systemic properties, and you're focusing on what is being transmitted through those various systems, whether it be language flowing through the various means of reproduction of language, or whether it be genes flowing through the various bodies which are the means of reproduction of genes, or whether it be ideas flowing through minds which are the means of reproduction of ideas. I think it's interesting that you're focusing on that relationship between the entities that flow through and the flowing through itself, the substrate and the entity, or something like that. And I think, and what you seem to be arguing for here, correct me if I'm wrong, or maybe I'm extending or bastardizing what you're saying, is kind of an attempt to identify with other aspects of the system. I mean, clearly we are systems ourselves, we're systems of systems, and we're complex relationships of systems, internally and externally, with parts and wholes and all that kind of stuff. And you seem to be intrigued by the idea of identifying with other aspects of systems, possibly even defining some of those as godlike, perhaps for the same reason we might define the idea-making system as muse-like. And I think that's interesting. What have I written here? Something. To do that requires an act of imagination. I think that's fascinating. The fact that we can kind of do that. We can kind of ally ourselves imaginatively, almost as if it's ourself, with that flow that's moving through us. I mean, we do it intuitively, don't we? We identify with our family history and the family future that our children perhaps represent. We kind of partially identify with that. And at a completely felt level, I think. But also imaginatively with our mind children, the ideas that we've inherited and that we're passing on. And even language, we can kind of imaginatively, I think, identify with language. We know our mother tongue gives birth to ourselves and the language we speak, and we in turn give birth to the language the next generation speaks. So I think we do that. But that act of imagination, I think, is at least as interesting and as tricky as imagining the existence of gods. It's just what do we do with that? You know what I mean? What do we do with that? As we know, the history of God making is unfortunately tied up with the history of other kinds of power and the history of quests for authorization of certain kinds of knowledge, and both methodological and materialist reductionism are and have been, I think, useful tools to bring to that discussion about how knowledge becomes authorized and becomes validated, and when a certain limit should be placed upon that, so that we can't make extravagant claims, and we can keep our muse in check and not demand that it starts telling other people what to do, and similarly keep our identification with systems in check and make sure they don't start telling people what to do. It's just us writ large, isn't it? It's just us identifying. I say just, it's quite an achievement. Identifying with systems that we aren't perhaps naturally meant to identify with, if that makes any sense. Okay, let me see if I've finished there. You end by talking about whether there could be systems out there thinking about us. We don't know. I don't know if there are or not. I doubt it personally. We seem to have the most complex, if complexity is anything to measure, brains are the most complex things so far discovered in the known universe. And it's unlikely we'll find anything large that's that complex, simply because largeness, size, doesn't permit that kind of complexity. But we don't know, as you say, we're at the limits of methodological reductionism. So we can speculate poetically about that, with that speculation not being a weak and inferior form, but interesting. Anyway, that's the phone ringing in multiple ways, so I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.